Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today, we're going to talk about whether or not you can use plastic or steel when you're making homemade kombucha. So this is a really common question that I get from a lot of home brewers is, does it matter what materials you use during the fermentation process? Are there any materials that would react negatively with an acidic brew like kombucha? So my recommendation is to always make sure that you're using food grade materials, whether you are putting your kombucha in it for an extended period of time, or if it's just going to be coming into contact with the liquid for short periods of time. Just make sure that it's always food safe. I'll go ahead and just walk you through some of the materials that I use over the course of the first and second fermentation process, just to give you an idea of what my personal preferences are as I go through the brewing cycle. But again, as long as it's food safe, you're generally in the clear. So stainless steel, plastics that are BPA free and that are resistant to higher temperatures are fine. Silicone's okay. Wood is fine as long as you make sure that all of these materials are clean and rinsed of any, if you use dishwashing soap or anything to clean your materials, just make sure that's rinsed really thoroughly with water before it comes into contact with any of your kombucha ingredients or materials. So for first fermentation, I like to use a French press to steep my tea just because it's really easy to just throw my loose leaf tea leaves in there, throw my sugar in there, and just strain all the leaves out and pour it into my brewing vessel really simply. So this is stainless steel. It has worked consistently for me. It's really great. I'll also say that you can find a link to all of my favorite and recommended products at You Brew Kombucha under brewing materials. I've bought and tested a lot of different materials over the course of my kombucha brewing journey. So the ones that I've put on my website are the ones that are tried and true, have lasted a really long time, are really good quality. So if you want my recommendations, I'll link that in the description box down below. Okay. If you're brewing high volumes of kombucha and say you're making 3 gallons at a time, I went through a phase where I was making just large volumes of kombucha all at once. A French press didn't quite cut it in terms of having enough space for all of my loose leaf teas to actually bloom and steep. So I love this larger pitcher. Again, this is linked on, the link to this is on my website, but what I love about this is not only is it great for steeping tea, but you can also use it for just making different types of like fruit water infusions or cold brewing tea or even cold brewing coffee. But what I love about this is that there is already a built-in strainer right in the cap. So whenever I'm using this glass vessel to brew hot tea, I feel safe pouring hot boiling water into this without worrying about the plastic melting or leaching out into the brew because I am using hot water. So this is a really great purchase. And if my tea leaves are all in there, if I've thrown my sugar all in there and it's steeping, once it's done steeping, it's really easy to just pour the liquid out because there's a nifty strainer on the cap that will just catch all of the tea leaves and leave it in the vessel. Moving on to the actual for first fermentation phase, I always recommend brewing in a glass jar just because they're really affordable, they're really easy to find and accessible, and I've just never had any issues with it. But I also brew beer, and there are a lot of different conical fermenters or different fermentation vessels out there that are made of other materials. So I actually have a conical fermenter that I use for brewing beer that's made of plastic, food safe plastic, that it's safe for low pH and high acidic beverages like beer and kombucha. So if I'm brewing a majorly huge batch of kombucha, I'll occasionally use my beer fermenter for that. But on the day-to-day, I just like to stick with a basic gallon glass jar. Moving on to the transition from first fermentation into second fermentation, I always recommend that when your first ferment is done with its first fermentation phase and you're ready to bottle, to remove the pellicle and to give the liquid a good stir. So I know there's a lot of controversy on Reddit and on YouTube comments about whether or not you can use plastic or steel or what materials you can use to stir your kombucha. I'm not super picky about this, mainly because it's only coming into contact with a liquid for a very short period of time. And the reality is that kombucha, the pH of kombucha is not so low that it is going to be corrosive to most food safe materials in any way. So if you feel comfortable stirring vinegar, just straight up vinegar in your kitchen with it, then I feel comfortable using it to stir my kombucha. So whether that's a wooden spoon, a food safe stainless steel spoon, a silicone spoon, I use all of the above, just whichever one happens to be handy when I'm stirring my kombucha or when I'm transferring them into bottles. And then the same goes for funnels as well. This is a stainless steel one. This is a food safe plastic one. I use them interchangeably, and I've had no adverse effects. And then moving on to the bottling phase, I prefer glass, again, just because it is readily available. These are my favorite types of bottles to use. I just find that they hold up well to the second fermentation process. I've never had an issue with the carbonation causing the bottles to break or explode in any way. And I know that's a reason why some people would prefer to use plastic instead of glass during the second fermentation phase. Because I use really good quality bottles, and if you want recommendations on the bottles that I use, be sure to check out my video on bottles, because I share basically the criteria that I use to determine what makes a good quality bottle, what are the types of bottles that you should look out for and avoid using if you're going to be using it for fermentation, and particularly for a beverage that's going to be naturally carbonated, where pressure will build up in the actual vessel. So if you are going to be undergoing a second fermentation and trying to carbonate your kombucha, I prefer glass. Some people will say, yes, go ahead and use glass, but also keep a plastic bottle along with your batch so that you can basically use the plastic to feel how pressurized or how carbonated that liquid is. And it's just good as a gauge to see how far along in the second fermentation process your brews are. And if you decide to do, that's totally fine. I generally avoid single-use plastics, but that's just a personal choice on my part. If you have extra plastic bottles lying around and you want to use it for kombucha, feel free to do so. I don't have a lot of experience in that realm, so I am hesitant to make any specific recommendations about the types of bottles. I know that different bottles are made with different materials, and I'm definitely not an expert in that realm, so I won't pretend to have any specific recommendations. But for me personally, I always just stick to glass bottles for second fermentation because I have them, they're quality, you can reuse them. Less single-use plastics on the world is generally a good thing. Those are my recommendations as far as materials for kombucha brewing go. I hope this was helpful. You can find a link to all of my favorite recommended materials and where you can buy them. I'll put a link down in the description box below so that you know where to find that. And I hope you found this video helpful. You can definitely check out the rest of my YouTube channel if you have other questions you're curious about. And as always, you can find more resources at youbrewkombucha.com. Happy brewing!